Hi everybody, my name's Connor. I'm a final year physiotherapy student at Bournemouth University. Back in January 2020, I completed my literature review on the topic of barefoot running biomechanics. So that's what I'll be discussing throughout this presentation today. Hope you enjoy. So I just want to start with some background knowledge. Now, during running, the front foot can make initial contact with the ground with either a rear foot, midfoot or forefoot strike. With a rear foot strike, the heel or the rear section of the foot will make contact with the ground first. Now we see this most commonly in runners, especially in runners wearing typically cushioned running trainers. With a midfoot strike, the middle section of the foot will strike the ground first, and with a forefoot strike, as we can see in the bottom picture here, the forefoot or the ball of the foot will make contact with the ground first. Now this is a little bit less common, but we tend to see this more often in barefoot runners or runners who wear minimalist footwear. Upon initial ground contact, the front foot will strike the ground with a certain amount of force. Now, that force will be counteracted by an equal yet opposite amount of force called ground reaction force. Ground reaction forces travel in all different directions, but right now we're most interested in the vertical ground reaction force. We're also really interested in the vertical loading rate. Now, vertical loading rate refers to the speed or the rate at which the vertical ground reaction force is applied upon the lower limb upon initial ground contact. Now, vertical loading rate is typically measured by force platforms embedded within running tracks or force sensing treadmills. Interestingly, a higher vertical loading rate has been associated with running-related injuries such as tibial stress fractures and plantar fasciopathy. Now, at the same time, a lower vertical loading rate has been associated with a forefoot strike landing, and this has been demonstrated throughout multiple studies. Barefoot running and running in minimalist footwear has become popularised in recent years, in large part due to the release of a popular book called Born to Run. Now, the idea behind barefoot running is that it allows the foot and ankle to mobilise and move in a far more natural manner, more so than how a typical cushioned running trainer would allow for. Now, interestingly, barefoot running has been found to promote a forefoot strike landing, which subsequently reduces vertical loading rate, which, as we've discussed already, has been associated with a reduction in running-related injuries. Now, this really raises the question over what type of landing pattern we utilised before the invention of cushioned running trainers. Now, utilising a rear foot strike landing during barefoot running significantly increases the vertical loading rate. However, cushioned running trainers reduce the vertical loading rate and the ground reaction forces during a rear foot strike landing, which might explain why so many runners utilise a rear foot strike landing, and this was all initially discovered by Lieberman and colleagues. So my literature review asked the question, what happens to vertical loading rate and landing pattern in runners accustomed only to typical cushioned running trainers when acutely trialling barefoot running? All participants were tested running barefoot and in their running trainers. So what did I find? During barefoot running, in comparison to running in cushioned running trainers, the vertical loading rate on average increased across all runners. Now this was irrespective of landing pattern. However, the vertical loading rate decreased in those runners utilising a forefoot strike landing or a more plantar flexed ankle at initial ground contact, or in other words, a more pointed ankle at ground contact. So this result does correspond with the initial findings of Lieberman and colleagues, and this data also suggests that there probably just weren't enough runners utilising a forefoot strike landing for the vertical loading rate to decrease on average throughout the studies. Now, the foot strike patterns were mixed and inconsistent. Foot strike patterns are fairly non-specific in the sense that they only tell us which third of the foot strikes the ground first. However, when I looked at a far more specific kinematic measurement of ankle motion, it turned out that the degrees of plantar flexion at the ankle upon initial ground contact on average increased. Or in other words, in the barefoot condition, the runners did land with a significantly more pointed foot upon initial ground contact. Now, it's reasonable to assume that this increase in plantar flexion upon initial ground contact just wasn't enough to constitute a fully fledged forefoot strike landing. Now, this may explain why the vertical loading rate did not decrease on average throughout the studies. So just some further considerations. Repeated barefoot running over longer periods of time produces similar results. Runners land with a more plantar-flexed ankle at ground contact. Again, the vertical loading rate does not decrease on average across all runners, but does decrease in runners utilising a far greater amount of plantar flexion at ground contact. It's also been found that vertical loading rate decreases in runners consciously employing a forefoot strike landing under instruction, and this applies to runners wearing cushioned running trainers as well. So this really tells us that vertical loading rate is more dependent upon landing pattern than it is whether a runner is wearing cushioned running trainers or running barefoot. Now, barefoot running in conjunction with utilising a forefoot strike landing, or at least a midfoot strike landing, reduces the amount of stress at the knee, but increases the amount of stress at the ankle, and in particular at the Achilles tendon. Now, Altman and Davis in 2016 found that barefoot runners experience more calf injuries, but less knee and hip injuries. Now, their study did have some limitations, so I do suggest you do have a look at the study, which you can find in the reference list. Now, barefoot running, again in conjunction with utilising either a forefoot strike or a midfoot strike landing, has been found to reduce the amount of internal rotation and adduction at the hip joint upon initial ground contact. Now, theoretically, this should help the knee to experience internal rotation in the way that it should upon initial ground contact, as well as reduce excess valgus or excess abduction at the knee upon initial ground contact. Now, this has been proposed to inhibit the mechanisms by which patellofemoral pain syndrome typically occurs, in which the knee joint feels external rotation upon initial ground contact, causing the patella to track laterally, causing pain, whereas what should be happening is the knee should be internally rotating upon initial ground contact. Thanks for listening to my presentation. I hope you found it interesting. If you'd like me to send over my literature review to you, or if you'd just like to have a talk to me about my findings, just drop me an email and I'll be happy to do so. Thanks very much.